Hi, in this video, we'll do a demo walkthrough of relations and rules within DataForge. So we'll go through a couple quick examples, and then we'll actually go through the setup, starting with some simple rules, adding some relations, and then working our way up to more complex rules. So if we start in our DataForge workspace, I actually have an existing set of sources that I'm going to use just to show you a little bit around how to navigate relations and rules, how they work. So if I open my sales order detail source here, we can see I've got an existing input. I've got some data to work with. I have a number of different fields in my raw schema, a number of different attributes I can use. And then if I go to my relations tab, I can actually see that I have two relations already set up. If I open one of these relations, we can see the relation name. We can see the sources that represent this source and then the related source, so representing both sides of the relation. And then we can see the expression listed out here as this dot sales order ID. So the sales order ID from this source I'm currently looking at, which is sales order detail. And then it's equal to the sales order ID from the related source, which is sales order header in this example. Now, when relations are saved, DataForge is smart enough to recognize and calculate the cardinality of the relation, which will help you when you're building rules to make sure that you never blow out the grain of your data. So in this case, we have a many-to-one relation where there's many records in sales order detail that relate to one record each in sales order header. Now, if I cancel this, a couple other things about relations, we can look at it in table format. We can also look at it as a graph. So we can see in here a kind of an easier visualization of all the different sources that I could potentially connect to from sales order detail. And we can see that there's actually multiple paths on certain sources. So for example, between currency rate and currency, I actually have two different relations that I could use. And we'll walk through in this video how we can actually differentiate which relation path we use on which rules. If we jump over to our rules tab, you can see that I've got one test rule currently on this source. So if I open this up, we can actually see the different types of rules that are available within DataForge. So we've got enrichments, which are typically, right, enriching your data. You're adding a new column. You're calculating some new data set. A validation type source is really a true false. It's a Boolean field that validates a certain set of data. And then we have subsources, which are used with more complex data types, such as arrays of structs. And we won't actually cover those in this video, but we will in a different video. Now, when you create rules, you'll give the rule a name. So in this case, it's test rule. That will automatically get converted to a normalized rule name or attribute name. So here we've got test underscore rule. And this is really the name that's going to be referenced. So if I was to create another rule that points to this rule, this is the name that will be used throughout the remainder of the system. We can give the rule an optional description. Each rule will have a specific data type associated with it. So in this case, I can see it's string. As you're working with more complex data types, such as arrays and structs, you'll be able to use the attribute schema to understand further more details around that actual data type schema. And then we have this attribute data type, which is another way to actually cast that data type to a different data type. And then we have our rule expression, right? So in this case, we're using a relation between sales order detail and customer so that we can grab the account number. And once we use a relation in a rule, we'll see those relations actually listed out along with their different traversal paths in the expression parameters below. So we can see in this case, we've got one parameter for that account number reference. And to get there, we actually use two different relations in the traversal path. So we go from sales order detail to sales order header using this relation here, this FK sales order detail relation. And then for the second relation, we go from sales order header to customer. And so we can see that DataForge will also show us that representation. And if there were multiple paths here, which we'll see in this example video, we would actually be able to use a drop down here to redirect this traversal. And the last couple things in rules are the recalculation mode. So by default, a rule will get created with a snapshot recalculation mode. However, there is also an option for keep current. And the difference between these is that for snapshot rules, they are calculated on the batch of data as it's ingested or as it's processed. Or if you manually kick off a recalculation of all the rules. However, a keep current rule will actually recalculate for all the data in the source anytime new data comes in or changes. So typically, a lot of your rules are going to be snapshot. However, there are definitely uses for keep current, one of them being window functions, which we'll also cover in this video. Now, the last flag that we're going to look at here is this unique value. And this actually marks the rule results as unique within the table itself. And so we'll look at an example of where you might use this to force the cardinality to actually be many to one or one to many, if you will. So if we cancel out of this, what we're actually going to do is go to a new project and we'll start to create some of these from scratch. So if I go to my training project, I can see that I have three different rules in here, or excuse me, three different sources in here. We've got customer, sales order detail, and sales order header. And if I open these up and I look at my relations, I'll see that I don't actually have any relations already created. Now, one way I could have done this is, since I'm working with table sources, is I could have gone into my connections and I could have opened the connection, and in connection metadata, I can actually bulk create sources along with their relations using the primary and foreign keys from that database. So for example, I could have done this and selected those three sources I wanted, and then I could have used the menu to hit create sources, and you'll see this create relations toggle here on the modal that pops up. And so if you make this true and you hit OK, that would actually bulk create these three sources as well as all the relations between the three sources based on those primary and foreign keys. So it's just a really quick way to get started, especially if you're working with a lot of different tables and you need to get them all created very quickly. So that's actually what I did in the previous project that we were looking at. Now in this one, we're going to kind of start from scratch. So what we're going to do is open our sales order detail source. And the first thing that I want to do is actually start creating some simple rules. So we'll start very basic, and then we'll work our way up to more complex rules. So the first thing is I'm going to look at my raw schema. And I can see that I've got a number of different attributes in here. The first two that I'm going to work with are the unit price and the unit price discount. And I'm going to use those to calculate a discounted price that I can then use to calculate a sales total for each order detail record. So if we go to our rules, again, we can see that we don't have any currently set up. What we're going to do is start creating a new one with this new button. And again, we've got our different types. We're going to default to enrichment, which is what we're going to use for this rule. And we'll call the rule discounted price. And then for the rule expression, which you can see in the note here, is that we're going to start with an open bracket, and that will actually allow us to select from which source do we want to grab which attribute from. And so right now, if I open that, if I use that open bracket, you can see that I can really only select from any attributes in this source container. So I'll select this, and then we're going to add a period here, and that will actually open up another kind of autofill menu here where you get a list of all the different attributes that are available within the source, including raw attributes, any rules that are already set up, as well as system attributes. And the difference between them is we would see raw attributes as the blue, system attributes will be black, and rules, which we don't have any currently set up, will be represented as green. And so we can see that in the data types here. Another note here that we saw as we were scrolling through is we can see any unique columns marked with this primary key icon here. And so what we're going to do in this one is we're just going to stick with the unit price, and we're going to multiply it by 1 minus, again, I'm going to use the open bracket to reference a new attribute and a period, and then we will reference that discount. Okay, and we can see that DataForge actually validates this expression as you're typing it. So that's one really nice thing, is you don't have to worry about whether the formula will run correctly when you actually run the recalculation. So now that we have a valid rule expression, and we want to keep it on snapshot just to keep it easy, we're going to hit the save button here, and we'll save that rule. Now the next thing that I want to do is actually use that same rule in a new rule so that I can calculate the sales total. So what I'm going to do is actually just, again, create a new rule. I'll give it a name, so sales total. And then we'll start adding our source container and attribute references as well. So what we're going to do is use this, and then we'll add a period. And then we can see that new rule that's already in here. Even though we haven't recalculated the actual data on the table yet, we still have that metadata in DataForge, so we can keep writing our rules. So we'll say discounted price times this, and then we'll actually use order quantity in this case. And then we'll save this. And now the last rule that I want to create for now is actually a validation. So what I want to do is create a column in my data set that checks whether each record has an order quantity or not. So I'll give it a rule name. And then with validations, there's an extra setting that you're going to set here. So when the expression is basically results in a false value, what do you want it to do? So do you want it to warn you? Do you want it to fail? Or do you want it to just ignore this setting? And so in this case, I'm just going to set it to warn. And that's essentially just an extra system column that you would have in your table that identifies that warning or that failure, etc. So in the expression, again, we'll reference this, and we will reference the order quantity and just say if it's greater than 0. And then we'll save this new rule. And so you've gotten the idea of a couple basic rules, right? Where we can directly reference existing attributes, or we can add some simple logic in here to check whether it's greater than 0 or do some math. Now the next piece of this is what if I actually wanted to pull data from the sales order header source? So rather than sales order detail, what I want to do is pull data from sales order header and use it to calculate data within sales order detail. What I need to do is actually create a relation in one of these two sources to point at the other. So what I'm going to do is open the sales order detail back up. I'll go to my relations tab, and we're going to start creating a new relation. And so in this case, I'm going to stick with the naming convention of, source 1 dash, and then the join key or condition in here. And then we'll reference the other source. And so the relation name is really free form. It's up to you. However, when we look down below, again, we're going to look at this source. So it's always pointing to the source that I'm currently on right now, which is sales order detail. And then we're going to select the related source, which is going to be the sales order header. And then we're going to add our relation expression. And so in this case, we're going to use this. So for this container, and actually if I back up, when you use the open bracket to reference the source container, you'll notice that it's slightly different than in the rules, where now you're only ever referencing either this source or the related source to tell DataForge how it should actually match up. So we're going to say this, and we'll say sales order ID is equal to, and then the related dot sales order ID. And again, we can see that key icon, which means that this is a key column. And essentially that just represents a one side of a relation if you're talking about cardinality. So when we save this, we can see that the cardinality is not there yet, but as soon as we save this, DataForge will actually check that cardinality for us. And if we reopen it, I can now see that I have a many-to-one relation similar to what we looked at earlier. And this, again, will drive how you actually write your rules. So if you're going from one to many, you're going to either aggregate or not aggregate, depending on which direction you're actually using. Okay, so now that we have our relation in here, we're going to add a new rule again. And this time we're going to actually reference something from sales order header. So we're going to create a new rule, and we'll call it order date. We'll add the rule name in there, and then we can start our open bracket. And now we can see, now that I have a relation pointing to another source, I can actually select from another source other than this. So we're going to select from sales order header. And then we'll, type a period here, again, to see those attributes. And then we're going to go down and select the order date in this case. And again, we can see our parameter that's used in here. We can see the relation that's actually used to get from source 1 to source 2. And then we can save this rule. So now the next question is, what if I wanted to pull data from customer to use in sales order detail? What do I have to do? I have to create another relation, right? And so I can either create a relation from sales order detail to customer, or I can create a relation from sales order header to customer and use the existing relation I have between detail and header as the first part of that relation path. In this case, since I know the data, if I look at the raw schema of the sales order header, I've got a column in here that is my customer ID, and that's actually what I'm going to use to join to customer. So if I go to relations, what I'm going to do is create a new relation, and we can see just a quick call out, we can see that exact same relation we created in sales order detail, but on the reverse side. So now I can see that this relation is going to many when I look at sales order detail. So I'm going to create a new relation in here, and we'll call it sales order header, customer ID, and customer. And again, I'm going to select the related source, and I'm going to add my relation expression. So this customer ID is equal to the related customer ID. Again, a pretty simple expression, just one field equals the other field, but it could be much more complicated depending on the logic in the data set that you have. So we'll save this relation. And so now if I look at my graph, I can actually see that I have a relation path to get from sales order detail to customer by going through sales order header. Now, when I look at the relation itself, we can actually see though that it's many to many, right? Because in this case, I don't actually have a key column in my, in my customer source. I don't have a key column to join on. The customer ID is not marked as unique. So therefore the relation gets calculated as a many to many. So I would have to aggregate data either way I look at it. However, if I wanted to force a many to one relation, what I can actually do is, since I know that this field is unique within the data set, I can actually create a rule on this customer source, which we're going to do right now. And we'll just call it unique customer ID. And then we'll write the expression basically just to directly reference that raw attribute. And then we're going to mark this unique value flag true. And so we'll save that. And we'll actually see two rules get created. The first is that unique rule that I just created. And then DataForge, just to make sure that there's data integrity and it is truly a unique field, there will be a validation that gets added every time you mark a rule as unique. And this will essentially just check and validate that, yes, it's unique, or it will force it to be unique by skipping over other records. And so you'll see that in there as a keep current. And so it'll always be checking, is it unique or not, every time data changes or is brought in. So anyways, now that I have that unique record or that unique rule, what I can do is go back to my relation. And now that I've opened the relation from the customer side, this container is actually related to customer. So I'm just going to wipe out the previous reference to the raw attribute. And now what I'll do is actually point it at that unique field for unique customer ID. And so now what we're going to see is when I save that relation, it went from many to many to one to many. And so now I've just basically told DataForge, hey, I know that this is a unique side of the relation. It should be one cardinality. And so that's one way that you can kind of force the cardinality versus having DataForge read based off of the attributes that you're using. Okay, so now that I have this relation, what I want to do is actually go back to my sales order detail, and we're going to keep creating new rules in here. So I'll go back to my rules tab, I'll hit new. And actually before I do that, one thing I forgot to mention is because the customer source, I added a new rule in here that actually looks for that unique field. What I want to do is just make sure that that field is actually populated so that when I'm recalculating other sources that point to this and that use the relation, there's actually a value in there for the relation to reference. So what I'm going to do is actually recalculate this customer source, which I can do on the rules tab here. Similarly, I can go to my inputs and hit the header level menu and just hit recalculate. And then we'll proceed with that. And so while that actually runs, now we'll go back to sales order detail and we'll keep on writing our rules. So the next rule that I'm going to create is actually just to pull the store ID from the customer all the way down to the sales order detail. So I'll hit a new rule here, and we'll call it customer store ID. And then we'll start writing our expression. And again, now that I've done the open bracket, I can actually see two different sources that I have an option of connecting to or referencing. So now I want to reference customer, and I'm going to reference the store ID field within customer. Okay, and so now I can see that the expression parameter gets built up because we're using those relations. And we can actually see that relation traversal path by going from sales order detail to sales order header and sales order header to customer. So now we'll save this rule. And then the next rule that I want to create is a little bit more complicated, but what I really want to do is I actually want to aggregate all of my sales, my total sales, based on that store ID that I created. So what I'm going to do is create a new rule, and we're actually going to write a window function within DataForge. So we'll call this store sales total. And then how we use window functions within DataForge, we're going to add our aggregate here. So we're going to sum, and then I'm going to reference, and I want to aggregate a field from this source, and it's going to be referencing that sales total rule that I created or calculated. Then we're going to close our sum, and then we're going to sum it over, and we're going to partition by that store attribute that we created. So we'll add this in, and then we'll go reference that customer store ID, and then we'll close the parentheses. And so we can see now that I've added this window function, there's a message that pops up from DataForge. Again, smart enough to understand that when I'm running a window function, I need to actually run this as a keep current so that it's always calculating the right value based on this expression. So what we're going to do is switch this to keep current, and then we're going to save this rule. Another way to do that same exact thing, is actually using a self relation. So what we can do, rather than using this window function and using the rules that we have here, what we're going to do is create a new relation, and we're going to add the rule name here, and I'll just call it self relation, and we'll call it store ID. And for this source is sales order detail. The related source is also going to be sales order detail. So we're just effectively going to look at the same source. And then the relation expression, again, same syntax. We're going to set this, and we're going to set the related. So in this case, it's going to be customer store ID, and we're going to set it equal to the related customer store ID. Okay, and so we can save this. And then if we open that relation, we can see that it's many to many within this self relation. And so now we can go back and actually create a second version of that rule just to show you how it works. And so we'll call it store sales total self relation. And so now when I open my open bracket here in the expression, I can actually see this customer, sales order detail, and sales order header. So we see sales order details referenced even though that's actually this source. And that happens when you have a self relation as an option. So we can reference basically the other side of that relation, which is sales order detail, and then we'll reference that same sales total. And because it's a many to many, DataForge again is going to be smart enough to tell me that I need to use an aggregation to actually calculate this. So what I'm going to do is add a sum around this. And now we know that we have a valid rule. DataForge is happy. I can save my rules here. Okay, so now that I've actually created all the rules that I want within this example, the last thing that I want to do is actually recalculate this source because right now the rules exist within the source. However, none of the data has actually been calculated yet until we've kicked off that process within DataForge. And so we're going to kick off a recalculate here. And then as soon as this process is done, we'll take a look at Databricks and actually validate that our rule results are working correctly. So we'll head over to our Inputs tab and just check the source status here. And so we can see the source. We're going to take a look, and it looks like our attribute recalculation is complete. So that means that the hub table is now updated with our rule results. So what we're going to do is head over to Databricks. And there's two ways to do that. The first being on the settings page here, I can open the view, or I can select the data viewer and actually open that hub table to actually see the data and query it. So what we're going to do is, now that we've opened that direct hub table, I'm going to create a new query. And then we're just going to run this. I've already got my compute up and running, so it should be pretty quick. Now I can see that table, that sales order detail data. And so if I just scroll over, I should be able to see those new fields that I've calculated. So I've got my my store ID, I've got my discounted price. I have that validation field to check whether it has an order quantity or not. Got my order date. I can see my sales total, the store sales total here with the window function. And then similar, I can see the store sales total using that self relation. So let's head back to DataForge. Now, what actually happens when we have multiple paths within a relation traversal? So if we have multiple different options, what I'm going to do is actually go back to our original project, and we're going to open the sales order detail source again. And then what we're going to do is just quickly, we're going to look at that relation graph again. And what I want to do in this example is build a relation from sales order detail, or excuse me, not build a relation, those already exist, but I want to build a rule from sales order detail that looks at an attribute from sales territory and pulls that back. And again, we commented on this earlier, but there's multiple relation paths to actually get to territory. So we can go through order header directly to territory. We go from order header to customer to territory. We go order header to store to customer to territory. So there's many different options. And the way that this works is essentially you can go many to one as long as you want in the relation chain. However, if you end at a one to many, that's really where your path is going to end. So you can't go one to many, one to many. What you would have to do in that case is break up your rule into two different rules so that you calculate in two different places, right? And then pull it down. So again, DataForge is going to be smart enough to limit you and not provide that as an option. But let's go ahead and take a look at our rules in here and actually create a new rule on sales order detail. So let's call it, just test rule 2. So very smart rule naming in here. And then what we're going to do is start writing our rule expression. So we'll start with that open bracket, and then we can see, obviously in this case, because I had I had DataForge bulk create the sources and all the relations using those primary and foreign keys. I have a lot more options in terms of which sources that I reference and how many relation paths I have. Otherwise, I could have built these by hand as well. But the source that I want to reference is going to be sales territory. And the field that I want to reference is just going to be cost last year. And so we can see that, again, the expression parameters gets built out. So we've got this one expression here, or one parameter. And then we actually have the relation traversal listed as well, the relation path. So what we can see is there's a mandatory hop from sales order detail to sales order header. However, when we get from sales order header and we're looking onward, there are multiple different options like we just looked at within the graph. So now I can use this dropdown to say, hey, do I want to go from order header directly to territory, or do I want to make a jump from order header to customer, and then from customer to territory, or maybe I want to go customer to store, and then store to person, and then person to territory. And so you can see how you can actually change your relation path depending on what logic you actually need to occur. Now, another cool feature within DataForge is just as a kind of a nonsensical example, I'm going to make another reference to the cost last year. And so we'll copy that same thing. And now we can see that there's actually two different parameters in here. And if I click on the parameter name, that actually highlights within the expression. So if you have a very complicated rule with the same attribute reference many different times, you can use this to very easily identify which relation path are you actually setting for which reference in here. So that's just another kind of cool feature within DataForge. Now, the last thing that I wanted to talk about is actually performance-wise. For when we're looking at relations, You're always better off to build a either many-to-one or one-to-one relation if you can, if the data allows you to, so that you're not doing as many aggregations. Now, that said, that's not always possible, and so you might have many-to-many or one-to-many relations in which you need to aggregate data from one side to the other. So that's just an overview of how rules and relations work. Hopefully this helps. Thanks.